A while ago, I'd spent a stormy night sketching vampires, exploring character designs and costumes for an illustration inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. Today, I finally get to share the painting that came from those sketches, my process from preparing the paper surface to final details and varnishing. And everything I learned along the way, as this was my most ambitious, challenging, and complex painting yet. It all started with a clean pencil drawing. I kept the brush light and my pencils sharp to capture detail without overwhelming the delicate paper surface, even using a 0.3 mechanical pencil for final touches. If I hadn't sketched all those poses, tried out different clothing options for the characters, explored their faces in sketches, and collected all my references, well, this would have been a much messier process. Having a clean sketch like this works best for me, as I like to paint small details and slowly build up a scene. Acrylics are my painting medium of choice, but this is hot-pressed watercolor paper. While I could just dive in with the acrylic paint right away, here I first applied a layer of matte softgel medium. Here I've applied some watery acrylic paint before the sealing with gel medium, so you can see the difference. As you can see, this doesn't smudge the pencil drawing at all. Despite me going at it pretty ruthlessly with my brush, I'd tried the same approach with transparent gesso once, and that just dissolves the pencil lines completely. Why am I sealing the surface, you might ask? Watercolor paper is very absorbent, which is of course great if you are working with lots of water and watercolor paints, but I want the acrylics to sit on top of the surface, not sink into it, so that I can work quickly and create very even paint layers, covering up the minimal paper texture hot-pressed paper has for a very smooth finish. You'll see how the paint acts in just a moment. This process was lots of fun. It turned the paper into what felt like some kind of artificial leather, and I got to just push and bend it around as it will flatten down naturally with the weight of the paint later. And I also applied gesso to the back to counterbend it in the other direction. This is something I love about working in acrylics. They are very forgiving, and I feel a little bit like an alchemist or a witch mixing potions and preparing scrolls as I go through this very hands-on process. I find this very freeing compared to the more delicate stretching of paper required for watercolors. Acrylics have helped me a lot mentally, as I know I can always turn a painting around, paint over elements I dislike, and any surface works for them. Here I'm starting the paint application after the gel medium surface has dried. The paint sits on top of the paper, can be pushed around with a clean brush or fingers or even a kitchen towel, creating really quick textures and filling in the entire page while still preserving details. I can still see the lines that I drew in pencil through this transparent underpainting. If I paint into an area by accident, I can push the paint to the side or wipe it off entirely before it has dried. If this were just paper, it would sink into it immediately and can't slide around anymore. In the past, I've also used gel medium on top of MDF panels and with even a thicker layer than here. And painting on that feels like painting on glass, incredibly smooth. Now that's of course a personal preference. I've painted on paper with gesso for more grain that the paint can grip onto, or on canvas to really take advantage of that cotton or linen texture, as well as on panels, wood, even a stone at one point. But what I like about paper in particular, it's great if you want to scan or photograph the painting at the end. I make prints out of my art, and this illustration in particular will be used as the cover of my Dracula art zine. So using a very smooth surface minimizes visible texture after scanning, and I actually managed to scan this painting in multiple parts that I then stitched together in Photoshop. Canvas, for example, can be very tricky to digitize, requiring a more elaborate camera and lighting setup to get a proper reproduction. Next, paper is easiest to store. I don't have much space, and a single stretched canvas painting takes up more of it than a stack of a dozen sheets of paper. I also just love the drawing process on paper. When painting on canvas, I only have very rough sketches underneath, and panels too feel less pleasant to draw on, as the surface is so unrelenting. At this point, I'd filled in the entire background with shades very close to the final colors. That will help me balance the paint mixes used on each of the characters and give me a visual guideline for the overall painting. I also took a moment to experiment with my two gel medium options. The matte soft gel by Golden that I'd used as a sealant is great when stretching out a paint mix, but it can feel a bit tacky when painting with it. The Liquitex Ultra Matte is completely new to me. It feels more pleasant to layer brush strokes with. Not tacky at all, but I have to experiment with both of these more in the future. Gel mediums also help to build up paint layers more quickly. I don't want my acrylics to be too watery, but to cover up the paper texture. And mixing paint with gel preserves transparency and doesn't use up that much of my expensive paints. I gave my 3 acrylic mediums a closer look here on mixed media paper. The soft gel gloss is what I've been using for the longest time, to mix isolation coats or seal surfaces, sometimes to mix with paint, but the glossy effect isn't always what I want, so I've added the matte gel to my collection very recently. These both dry completely transparent, and I could actually barely see the matte gel on the paper after it dried, with how perfectly it seemed to disappear. These kinds of gels are also great when creating impasto textures, like this little blob I added here. On the other hand, the Liquitex Ultra Matte dries slightly less transparent, but it comes with one incredible advantage. The surface is workable with pencils and colored pencils. This is a tip I saw one day on Muddy Colors, which is an amazing resource website. If you're not familiar with it, I recommend you check it out, where I encountered this in an article about mixed media work, where the two soft gels feel very much like the plastic they are, and the pencils have nothing to grip onto. The Ultra Matte Gel creates a surface that feels like a mixed media paper with a hint of grain, and both my Caran d'Ache and also some very cheap colored pencils worked equally well on it. I was even able to then layer it with that Chinese white Derwent drawing pencil that I love so much. I'm very excited to take advantage of this in future mixed media pieces, combining acrylics and a variety of drawing tools over multiple layers. I started with Dracula's brides on the left side of the page. Not doing a proper underpainting for the entire illustration isn't an approach I'd often recommend, but here I already knew the overall colors and values I wanted and felt secure in my sketches and references to go character by character, without the entire thing then falling apart. I actually work faster this way, pushing each character or each area of the painting, sometimes with multiple figures at the same time, to a level of detailing that works at a first glance. If I paint everything at the same time, I often end up just bouncing around the painting aimlessly, endlessly, avoiding commitment. This forces me to really finish one character and see how that looks and then evaluate further from there. The brides of Dracula weren't featured in my sketchbook session, but they are also the simplest character designs. Just textiles and skin, going for that unsettling, kind of nonchalant violence and seduction they show in the book. I forced myself to really capture the shadow shapes. Well-lit references of the human body and face help so much with that. I used alizarin crimson hue and burnt umber to make sure the shadows are vibrant, glowing as if with hellfire. And then took care not to blend them into the light areas. This is where acrylics really helped me. Sharp edges and decisive brush strokes. No blending after the paint has dried, so my shadows don't turn muddy. I started out with paint mixed with gel medium for those transparent shadows, and then built up the painting with pure acrylic paint mixes. Nearly no water, just a bit of golden retarder fluid, my favorite acrylic painting medium. While the shadows are transparent and don't contain any white paint, for the lighter parts, mixing with titanium white creates very creamy, opaque paint that I loved for the soft look of skin. I actually used the same model for all three of these. These are from a reference pack by Graphite Studio, and the consistent lighting and textiles made combining them very simple. But then I got to dive in and invent facial features and unique elements to each of the three. Whenever I had some burnt umber mix left over, I'd start painting on the four male silhouettes walking into the castle, entrapped by the story. I like to spread my color mixes around so that the individual elements tie together, often using one shadow color on another character's hair or one character's skin tone for the buttons on someone else's dress, to just tie the color palette together. I don't have much painting footage from those four figures, as I was painting the castle facade at the same time and had to focus on working quickly, with no time for camera adjustments. That's a downside to the fast drying times of acrylics. I often struggle with the filming of it all. The castle's grey and the clothing grey being the same shade also closed that particular color loop there, and I moved away from the left side of the paper to the center. Jonathan and Mina, the couple at the very center of the story. Jonathan narrates most of the beginning of the book, and Mina is the connecting element of his side of the story and Dracula's castle, and then the drama that unfolds in London. These two were the most difficult. I had sketches and some references for their clothing, but they stand at this threshold from the firelit castle entrance and the moonlit night. So I had to make up the lighting and find a way to make it all work together. Burnt umber and Payne's grey are probably my most used colors on this painting, and I avoided any blue more saturated than the Payne's grey. But for Mina, I brought in smalt blue, a favorite paint of mine. It's a very transparent shade, a blue leaning slightly towards lavender, and it's not very pigmented. Perfect for cooling down or neutralizing skin tone mixes without darkening them. Alizarin crimson, yellow ochre and smalt blue together work beautifully. I designed Mina to have a slightly darker complexion, and the smalt blue helped me create that shimmery moonlight hitting her face. Jonathan, on the other hand, is very pale. He went through quite an ordeal recently, and he has a warm yellowish undertone and is also partially hit by the firelight of the castle. So while I used the same paint tubes as for Mina's face, his mixture was very different. When I reached enough detail there for the moment, I moved to the scary part, Dracula himself. Scary not because he's a vampire, but because his face had given me trouble in the sketching phase and I was determined to get it right. I started with a skin undertone devoid of any red, yellow ochre and smalt blue and titanium white to give that slightly sickly greenish hue. You can see how right next to him Lucy then gets those pink and red shadows instead, to contrast with the undead creature towering over her. In the shadows of her very pale skin though, I used more of the smalt blue again. She's getting drained and is being turned into a vampire. There's a shadow leeching away life, and it's right there in the colors. This all of course wasn't planned ahead of time, but evolved while painting. Using a limited color selection and having a clear sketch to follow gives me a lot of room to then experiment and explore with windows. The paints I've mentioned so far, burnt umber and Payne's grey as the main colors of the entire illustration, titanium white for adjusting values, and then alizarin crimson, yellow ochre and smalt blue mostly for skin tones. I also used a true black and Mars black to push shadows, and some cadmium red and cadmium yellow for the fire. That's pretty much it so far. Having a limited selection of paint tubes helped me explore their mixes and interactions, and at this point I felt quite comfortable with them. The perfect moment to introduce something new. Cobalt green for the dress was my personal highlight. I've been excited to paint this ever since I found the dress reference in the Metz costume collection. To make this new paint work with the rest of the painting, I used the same smalt blue to cool it down. I can't stop singing that particular blue shade's praises, it's such a convenient color. There's less contrast to her values, making her look lit from a distant, unseen light source that only hits her, or as if she's glowing. Dracula, on the other hand, is this dark shape dominating the illustration, an extension of the castle itself. And it took me, as I predicted, a long time to paint his face. No matter how many references I look at, how much I sketch or prepare, there comes a moment where I have to go with the flow, keep painting, stepping away and coming back again, until a face feels right. There's reference and then there's this idea you have in your head about a character, about a certain look, and then there's what you discover while you paint. And in the Venn diagram of where those three meet, that's usually the sweet spot for me. One of the inspirations for this painting was the Souls at the Bank of Acheron painting, and Lucy is one of those souls, reaching over the Acheron, or here the dark shape of Dracula, towards her friends and love and life itself. It's why her hand reaching out has the most intense, vibrant colors. It's the one closest to her past, to her life and aspirations for the future. While the other hand, hidden in Dracula's cloak and to the very far side of the painting, is much more blue and grey and already part of death. I was testing out a new set of brushes. These are mostly medium-sized to large acrylic synthetic brushes, and while I transitioned to some of my miniature brushes for the really small details, as well as a Da Vinci Forte to really push paint into those small nooks and crannies, these were perfect for filling out all the major shapes and softly blend clothing and skin tones. I like artificial brush hairs as it's much easier to clean and much more resilient, and I was really surprised by these, especially since they are incredibly cheap, and while I had to cut a few stray hairs in the very beginning after I just unboxed them, they then held up surprisingly well, and I've been using them consistently since. I didn't really use any flat or filbert brushes on this entire painting as it was so very detailed focused. Though I did fill in some of the larger background shapes with a filbert at one point. As for convenience colors, these are what I've been using a lot combined with my main color palette for this painting. Titan Buff as a warmer, muted alternative to titanium white, which can be overwhelming in any color mix, and perfect for natural lightening of skin tone blends. Then there's Titan Green Pale, which is a bit brighter than the Titanium Buff, but with a cool green hue that works amazing for neutralizing reddish skin tones. And I mixed this into the Cadmium Red and Cadmium Yellow of the Castell's Fire Glow too. And then of course the Smalt Blue I've been raving about with its transparent cool lavender tone that kind of works for every color mix. At some point I also completely painted over these window shapes that I had originally planned for the castle wall. I just found them to be distracting, they upset the balance of the detail level of the image, and I also realized that having that black blank space would be perfect to add some text on, as it would be the back of the book. His eyes are very glassy, lifeless and empty, and I finally managed to capture just the barest hint of a smile instead of a full-blown grin or smirk. Especially when painting this small, even the tiniest hints of paint can completely change an expression. His clothing is detailed in some parts, but then dissolves into these dark, wild shapes, and the clothing that we can see is inspired by a much earlier time period than every other character's. I wanted him to feel ancient and not part of this world. I then went back over everything, again kind of from left to right, adding details, pushing contrast, creating highlights where necessary, and then stepped away for a few days before scanning everything. Using gel mediums and especially retarded medium and some open acrylics slows down the drying time, and I'd rather be safe than sorry. I was honestly surprised how smoothly this whole painting process went. Even with Mina's face and Dracula giving me some trouble, I got to find expressions and colors that, in the end, resonated with me. And I especially love how expressive Dracula's brides turned out for that very small size I painted them at. I'm also very fond of Lucy, her slightly pearlescent skin and the green dress. It feels amazing to finish a painting I was so scared of, something far out of my comfort zone of portraits and single figures, and then actually ending up with a piece that I like. I learned a lot about controlling my color palettes and values, and the process from sketch to final touches felt very natural and comforting to me, as I sat down nearly each night to paint just a little further. The scans actually didn't need much editing beyond stitching every single part together, so I mostly spot removed dust from scanning and made sure the shadows and highlights aren't blown out. I always use the same printing company, so at this point I know how to prepare my CMYK files for them. I only varnished the painting a few weeks later with an isolation coat to unify all the different surface textures. For the varnish, after the isolation coat has dried, I used Matte Finish by Liquitex, so while it looks shiny here at first, it does dry to a very smooth matte surface. I hope you enjoyed this painting process. Which character do you like best? Let me know if you have any questions about gel mediums or preparing surfaces for acrylics, and I'd be happy to talk about those more in future painting videos, as I think I'll stick to this type of approach for now as it works really well for me. This is now the wraparound cover illustration for my Windows into Dracula art zine, a little booklet of sketches, quotes and paintings to accompany the story of Dracula. I'm illustrating more characters for it right now during Inktober/Dractober and wanted to thank everyone who already pre-ordered. It's been so motivating to have those pre-orders come in, and I'm very excited to wrap up this project that I started nearly a year ago. The varnish painting is now put away safely. The varnish protects it from scratches and fading, and I'm happy to close out this video on the shiny look of it here as the varnish was drying. Thank you so much for watching as I paint this passion project, ramble about colors and mediums, and I hope you'll be back for future art videos.